All right. All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Tuesday, January 14th, 2020 Working Group Component Standard meeting. I'm going to share my screen quick here so we have the agenda. All right. So let's get started. Does anyone know who added the first item? Somebody wanted to talk about that.
Not sure.
Okay, I'll take it for now, and then if somebody comes in and says I wanted to talk about that, we can pick it up. So I guess there's this thread on Twitter sort of complaining about not being able to find enough documentation on Kubernetes configurations, I think specifically involving kubeadm and some of those component configs, but also maybe just in general. So I think that's something we should address. I think in general, our sort of API reference documentation for component config has not been particularly easy to find or accessible, since it's mostly just like look at the code for that Kubernetes version. We've talked about in the past generating OpenAPI reference documentation or generating Kubernetes reference docs for component config, but we've never done it, mostly because most of the APIs are alpha. It's probably time to start looking at that also, I think is the gist there. It looks like Lee added some links to different tools that can generate those kinds of docs, and said sort of maybe we should go ahead and include that with the with component base or something, or just have a common tool that we're using for all the component configs. So I think that's a good idea. So if folks want to work on that kind of config generation stuff or documentation generation stuff, that's good. I know PJVGF had expressed some interest last year in working on that. I don't know how much progress got made, so I'll follow up with them. And then I had another note, which is we do have these sort of config docs pages. So if you go here, there's links to supposedly the config for each of these components, but when you go there, they only report the command line options. And we should definitely, once we've gone to beta with a component config, be reporting that config struct here.
How are these generated or like populated?
I think this is just the like generated from the help text from Cobra, basically, right now.
Okay.
There's a tool somewhere, might be in the docs repo, that links all the Kubernetes components and then extracts it. But it's been years since I saw that, so. Lee, did you have any other thoughts on kind of the config docs?
Other than that help doc right there for how they are generated.
I think your mic might be a little unplugged.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Cool. Sometimes I cover it. Yeah, so there's that generation help page, and then Ben and I were chatting about whether or not the docs generation should live centrally somewhere, like in a Kubernetes SIGs repo or in even the component repo. Since components need doc generation, it's just a matter of whether or not those things should be imported when that repo is vendored.
Yeah, I'm curious whether we can just reuse the tools, or
I would imagine that like there may be a few paths and things like that that are hard coded that will need to be parameterizable, and then it's going to need to be able to link out to like other repositories.
Yeah,
because like if you want to generate documentation for kubelet v1 alpha 1, right, then you'll need to.
Yeah, you'll have to be able to export. So yeah, I don't know if it's just in KK or if it's been moved out.
That is an external type. So yeah, in the kubelet repo.
Yeah.
And we would be generating docs for the external types.
Right. So I'm wondering, because there's definitely a docs generation tool for the core APIs that come bundled with Kubernetes. There's, I'm assuming you just like construct a scheme and, well, it needs to read the comments out of the files. So, because it reads the doc comments out of the files.
Yeah.
So, but I'm imagining it must just scan for them because those APIs are all over the place.
Yeah, I mean, if you were to construct a vendor directory, then it should work.
Okay.
But yeah, that is a really good problem to tackle, because that previous thread that I linked was basically about like where the heck is this cluster configuration struct in KubeADM and how do I build one?
Right. Yeah. So this, anybody who wants to work on this is fair game. It's a really important area. I don't know, Ross, have you guys had some talks in KubeADM about how to document those APIs better?
Well, not yet. We actually encountered some problems with the Godot side, and in general, we actually strive to have things documented there, but it actually has some problems. So, for example, older APIs of which are actually supported in older Kubernetes versions are actually deleted if they are not present in the latest master version of KK.
Mm-hmm.
So this is one of the pitfalls that we actually encountered. And basically the idea there is to just use this site and some of the examples on the Kubernetes.io side. But like we haven't done any more particular like large explanation what goes where and stuff like that. It's just the comments and some examples, and we simply don't have the manpower to do that.
Got it.
Yeah, and then the other thing that people can reference is kubeadm config show default, show join defaults or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
With their version of kubeadm, you can output a config and it's somewhat populated, but yeah, it's not the whole thing.
Yeah. This is actually a nice command line interface, and it can even be picked up by other components, which is basically a command line interface to output the defaulted version of the component config.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, what was interesting was that this person trying to use kubeadm didn't even know like what an API version was and how to figure out what magical API version string they were supposed to use.
Yeah. But that's an onboarding problem, right? Like it's obviously, too hard to find something that basic.
Yeah, it just doesn't exist anywhere because we don't document the configs.
Yeah. I mean, it exists in, I think there's two questions. Like, I think it sounds like they probably knew what an API version was to begin with, because that's on all the other Kubernetes APIs. But
yeah,
they probably weren't able to find like which version am I supposed to set for kubeadm for this object.
Yeah, I mean, I found the right string like in two places in the docs, and they were not, like trivial areas. But,
so it seems that the concept of an API group, which can actually change and be like this large piece of string, is somewhat misleading, especially for not very experienced Kubernetes users, simply because most of the base Kubernetes types don't even have an API group, and you simply specify v1.
One. Yeah, it's just v1.
yeah, it's a shame that we don't actually like write core v1 there. But,
yep. Okay.
I mean, that's all I had for that.
Okay,
Great.
yeah, we'll reach out. I'll reach out in the Slack channel and see if anyone wants to try and tackle that. All right, Alex.
Yeah, so spent some time last office hours with Mike going through the command kube controller manager code, and basically just starting work on finding out if the current component config for controller manager is even serializable. And just the idea is to gather some data, like how would this look like? How would a config file look like? What are the pros and cons? What are the other options we have? How could like those be implemented? What are their like pros and cons? And just get the conversation going. Again, probably with another cap, like yeah, just list everything I found out and just try to get the conversation yeah, started again on what should we do in this area. So I'm just, yeah, basically writing some tests and stuff and seeing if I can serialize it.
Great. All right, keep us posted on your progress. That sounds awesome.
Yeah.
So the next thing I just wanted to highlight, I wrote a cap last week trying to move the instance-specific component config forward. This is a problem that sort of blocks like a lot of components from getting all the way there. So this cap's purpose is just to present a very simple solution to that problem so that we can make a decision and move forward. The solution is basically, add a new kind for instance-specific config, like kubelet instance configuration, or we can talk about, better names, but so that we can just put those fields like node IP and host name override in that, and have the option to plummet through a separate file if we so choose, so that we can decouple components that are like sharing a config map from these instance-specific fields that would prevent sharing a config map in production. So we've got some good feedback on it. I think it's mostly there. The only question is kind of like, do we choose to do a separate flag and force it to a separate file, or do we just allow like multiple invocations of dash dash config? And then how would that look in code, I think is the last piece here. I'm fine with either. I think Ross, you had some thoughts on multiple invocations.
Yeah, so I think that minus config is probably our best option, and like what we can do here is give more freedom to the users to basically either split their config in at least a couple of files, or even join that config in a single file, but with multiple YAML documents inside. So this is a much more flexible solution as opposed to just having separate flags for instance config, which will basically force users to always have their instance config in separate files, and this might not be very much useful, at least for some use cases. So, for example, in kubeadm, basically the kubelet and everything that is static pod backed, which is basically the API server, control manager, scheduler, are much more sane to be put in a single file as a couple of YAML documents, because we don't use, we cannot actually use the config map as a volume source.
Right. I think that makes sense. So I'll figure out what I think there was some prior art maybe in kubeadm for handling like the multi-docs and multiple files, like a sort of a framework for reading in a set and having accessors for that. Maybe I thought there was a comment on here about that, but I couldn't.
So the original idea was to have such a framework, but we haven't actually had the time to develop it yet. So we are not storing anything in multiple files. It's everything in one file.
Got it.
And yeah, and the other thing is that we actually use something called a document map, which is basically a standard Golang map between like the group and basically not the group, but the kind and the object, which basically allows us to have like a single group version kind per file. And this works for us, but it probably won't work for everyone. So it doesn't pay attention to object meta name, simply because the stuff which we actually use do not have object meta name.
Got it. Okay, I'll keep looking into that, see if I can find a simple solution for now.
The I like the multiple invocations of config as well.
Cool.
For the same reasons. Is that just some extra color on that? Is that the implementation, if you do something like that, should do a deep merge on the
I would probably want to not do any merging to start. Just either wholesale replace with the latest invocation, or throw an error if you specify the same kind twice.
How would you say if an IP address is in a substructure of like web server config, like only set the IP for a particular instance?
You don't. That's a shared, like the serving IP, like the interface to serve on, would be a shared option. The IP, the kind of IP I'm talking about is like the IP of the current node's interface on the local network. Right?
Yeah, that's used for serving for the kubelet.
So you can, so typically what we would see in production is like a kubelet would serve. It's a good question, but like, actually, this is a good question. How many people just serve kubelet on all interfaces versus not? So there, because that's a good point, that maybe there are some fields that like in most cases are shareable. Like in almost every production kubelet deployment I've ever seen, it just serves on 0000. But maybe people are trying to set that up differently on different places. And so maybe the real solution is just to have a way to override with, like you said, a deep merge, and we actually don't split it into separate objects at all.
Yeah, I mean, just as, somebody who's done a lot of piping config around and messing around with it, there are things that are easy to use and there are things that are not. And supplying multiple configs that override each other with the deep merge that's like natively supported by the tool is one of the easiest things to work with. Otherwise, you have to basically throw it in somewhere else.
I think there's no free lunch, right? Like you can't, like that gives you a lot of utility as far as like plumbing config down and getting it merged, but it can also make it, the trade-off is that looking at the final config, you have to trace back to, arbitrary number of merged objects to figure out where something came from, as opposed to being like, oh, it's only from like at most 2 objects.
Yeah, I mean, that's not as much of a trade-off if the kubelet can just output its configuration.
I mean, it still is, right? Like if the kubelet can output like what it's the final reified config is, but like you as the debugger have to look at that and then go, okay, where did each of these values come from?
So I think that like most of the Linux distros and in general software for Linux is basically suffering from this. So a lot of tools can actually fetch up configuration from like several, like 3 or 4 different places and then try and merge them. And the result is not always predictable. And usually when something goes wrong, users have to basically go and find all of the locations that may contain configuration files and then go and iterate over each configuration file and find like the wrong option there.
So basically there's these new types that are being built, I believe, for the API server for kubectl server-side apply. Sorry, not kubectl. And these new types track field ownership, and we could build, like a provenance, like config field provenance off of that.
I think it's more complicated than just consuming that because our plumbing is opaque, or at least more opaque, right? Like coming through a config map volume, how much information does the component really get about where those sources came from, and who really owns them? When you do it through the API server, you have the identity that made the request to change something, and you can attach that ownership. I don't think we have that.
Well, this would just be the file that it came from.
Yeah, that's a start, I guess. The file path.
Yeah, or I
Check the
mean,
file path.
if we were to have
Yeah.
object meta, then it could also have that in there. But
Yeah. All right, future things. I'll keep thinking about it to see if we can make a near-term trade-off. I think there's also, if we don't do a merge to start, we still can in the future, either in a future API version or in whatever. So I also want to think about and this is a more general problem that I maybe other people have thought about, but we've talked a lot about wanting to refactor the structural, like how our APIs are structured in future versions, including splitting large objects into smaller separate objects. And we also have this requirement that we be able to convert between concurrently available API versions and represent the same values in each. And so my question is, if we go from V1 to V2 and we split object A into objects A and B, our conversion machinery today doesn't seem to support going from like a single object to a set of objects, or from a set of objects to a single object. So there's probably a question with how we'd support that.
So we kind of did something like this in KubeADM when we actually split up our early alpha configurations in several kinds. And the way we actually did it was through a lot of custom code and a lot of hacks. So for example, at some point, we actually had to disable the fuzzer test and basically write up our own tests, which verify different types of conversions, but it's not cool, and it's like potentially dangerous, especially if you actually disable the fuzzer test. But sometimes it's necessary.
Right. Okay. So there's a way to do it, but it's not pretty.
as far as conversions, I would think you could just call the conversion function to multiple kinds from the source multiple times.
Maybe, but you don't necessarily know, I guess, how many times you have to call it.
Yeah,
Maybe,
you would need
you'd
you would need to do that explicitly for different targets.
Yeah, you would probably would you have to basically call it for every kind in the target version
I
just to see what
believe
you got?
so.
Yeah.
We could build something that like finds an annotation that does that automatically, but right now I think that's what I would do, is just
maybe that's,
because
it might not be too bad if you only have a few.
the component will own the API anyway, and the conversion will probably happen through the component. So
Yeah.
so the component can just call that multiple times for that particular version.
All right. We'll keep thinking about that too. I'll add a note here.
Fan in, that would be a little more difficult. You do something similar where you're mapping onto the same object or whatever. But
Okay. So I guess the last thing that's on here is looks like the CFP is open for the Contrib Summit at KubeCon EU 2020. So if folks are interested in speaking at the Contrib Summit, check this out. I will probably fill this out for giving a talk on our working group. I know, Alex, you're interested in doing something around this also.
Yeah. Would like a working group update fall under this, or?
Let me read through it and see.
Yeah.
Last time we did like a table, Lee, at the Contrib Summit stuff, right? And then we had a maintainer track talk on sort of the standard KubeCon track.
Okay. But like the maintainer track, that hasn't been finalized either, right?
I haven't seen anything yet about this. This is the first I've seen it, so it was sent out yesterday, so
yeah.
Yeah, I'll look through and see, because I want to go, and I think it'd be fun to see y'all in Europe.
Yeah, definitely.
So
yeah, go on.
So I think that this is for the contributor summit alone, and the maintainer track is a different story. And I think that we should probably poke some of the folks that are SIG leads. So for example, Tim Sinclair, Lubomir on the cluster lifecycle side, and they're actually doing some preparations for the projects. Not sure how this stands with work groups though.
Okay. Yeah, do you want to reach out to them, Ross?
Yeah, I can basically contact them.
Awesome, thank you. All right, that's the last item on our agenda today. Does anyone have anything else? All right, great. Take care, everyone. Have a great Tuesday.
You too. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.